The chamber was thick with cigar smoke and the low murmur of anxious voices. Outside, London burned. The fires from the previous night's bombing still smoldered in the distance, visible through the tall windows of the war rooms, casting an orange glow against the early morning fog. Churchill stood at the head of the table, his shoulders rounded, his face pale and creased with exhaustion. He had not slept. None of them had slept properly in weeks. The reports were grim. France had fallen. Belgium had fallen. The Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, gone. Britain stood alone now, an island fortress with its back to the sea and its enemy gathering strength just across the channel. The military advisors sat in silence, waiting for him to speak. They had run the numbers. They knew what the numbers said. Across the Atlantic, the Americans were still watching. Across the continent, the Soviets were still calculating. And across the channel, in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was laughing. The intelligence intercepts had come in that morning. A speech delivered to his inner circle, recorded by British operatives embedded deep within the Reich's communications network. Hitler's voice, translated and transcribed, dripped with contempt. He had called Churchill a relic, a drunk, a fool clinging to an empire already in ashes. He mocked his age, his speeches, his refusal to see what was inevitable. Germany had conquered Europe in months. Britain would fall in weeks. It was not a question of if, but when. Churchill read the transcript slowly, his thick fingers tracing the words. He did not flinch. He did not slam the table or curse or demand retribution. He folded the paper carefully, placed it in his pocket, and looked up at the men around him. They were waiting for rage. They were waiting for defiance. What they got was silence. He reached for his glass, half filled with whiskey, and took a slow sip. Then he set it down, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes. In Berlin, the mood was electric. The Reich Chancellery gleamed with marble and gold, its halls filled with the laughter of generals and the clinking of champagne glasses. Victory after victory had poured in like a flood. Poland crushed in weeks. France humiliated in 40 days. The British Expeditionary Force driven into the sea at Dunkirk, leaving behind their weapons, their dignity, their hope. Hitler stood at the center of it all, his eyes bright with certainty. He had rewritten the maps of Europe. He had avenged the Treaty of Versailles. He had proven the world wrong about Germany, about himself, about history. And now, only one obstacle remained: a small, rain-soaked island ruled by an old man who drank too much and spoke too long. The Freire's inner circle gathered around him, listening as he outlined the final phase. Operation Sea Lion. The invasion of Britain. The Luftwaffe would clear the skies. The Kriegsmarine would command the seas. The Wehrmacht would land on the shores of Kent and march into London before autumn. Churchill, he said, would be found hiding in some cellar, clutching a bottle and mumbling speeches no one would remember. The room erupted in laughter. It was not cruelty exactly. It was confidence. It was the sound of men who had watched the impossible become routine, who had stopped believing in limits. They did not hate Churchill. They pitied him. They saw him as a man out of time, a product of an old world that no longer existed, trying to fight a new kind of war with old ideas and older rhetoric. But they did not know him. Churchill had been many things in his life: a soldier in Sudan, a prisoner in South Africa, a journalist, a painter, a politician who had risen and fallen and risen again. He had made mistakes. Gallipoli still haunted him. A campaign he had championed that ended in slaughter and failure. He had been cast out of government, mocked in Parliament, written off as a warmonger and a relic even by his own party. He had spent years in the wilderness, warning about Hitler while others called him paranoid, extreme, drunk on his own rhetoric. And maybe he was. Maybe he drank too much. Maybe he spoke too much. Maybe he believed in things that no longer made sense, in a world of tanks and dive bombers and blitzkrieg. But he also believed in something else, something quieter, something harder to name. He believed that evil, when given everything it wanted, would eventually choke on its own appetite. The air raids began in earnest that summer. The Luftwaffe came in waves. Hundreds of planes blackening the sky, dropping bombs on airfields, on factories, on homes. London shook. Coventry burned. Children were evacuated to the countryside, clutching teddy bears and gas masks. The hospitals overflowed. The morgues overflowed. Every morning brought new lists of the dead. Churchill walked through the rubble. He visited the shelters, the hospitals, the fire stations. He did not give speeches about victory. He did not promise that everything would be fine. He stood in the wreckage and looked people in the eyes and told them the truth. It would get worse before it got better. Many of them would not survive, but if they held on, if they refused to break, then something else would break instead. The people did not cheer. They did not salute. They watched him, this old man in a rumpled suit with ash on his coat and exhaustion carved into his face, and something passed between them. Not hope, exactly. Something steadier. Something that could survive without hope. In Berlin, the reports began to change. The Luftwaffe was losing planes faster than they could be replaced. The RAF, smaller and battered, refused to disappear. Every night they rose again. Every day they found new ways to strike back. The invasion was delayed. Then delayed again. Then postponed indefinitely. Hitler stopped laughing. He stopped talking about Churchill. He turned his attention east, toward the vast frozen expanse of the Soviet Union, toward a new enemy he believed he could crush as easily as he had crushed the others. Operation Sea Lion was quietly shelved. The maps were redrawn. The focus shifted. But the war did not shift. It deepened. It spread. It metastasized. By the winter, the German advance into Russia had stalled. The cold was brutal. The supply lines were overstretched. The Soviet resistance was fiercer than anyone had predicted. And in North Africa, British forces were pushing back against the Afrika Korps, reclaiming ground, taking prisoners, turning the tide in the desert. 11 months after Hitler had called him a drunk fool, Churchill sat in the same smoke-filled room, surrounded by the same exhausted men, reading very different reports. The United States had entered the war. The Soviets were holding. The Germans were bleeding in the snow. Britain had not fallen. It had not even bent. Churchill did not celebrate. He did not declare victory or mock his enemy. He lit a cigar, poured another whiskey, and stared out the window at the city that had refused to die. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not flex. It does not dominate. It simply endures. It absorbs the blow, steadies itself, and remains standing. And in that standing, in that refusal to collapse, it changes the equation. It forces the aggressor to recalculate, to spend more, to commit more, to stretch further than intended. And in that stretching, cracks begin to form. Hitler had built an empire on speed and shock, on overwhelming force applied before the enemy could think, on the belief that willpower and destiny could reshape reality. But reality does not care about willpower. Reality cares about logistics, about morale, about the slow grinding mechanics of supply chains and occupied populations and soldiers who stop believing the war will end soon. Churchill understood this, not because he was a genius, not because he had a grand strategy, but because he had failed before. He knew what it felt like to be wrong, to be humiliated, to watch plans collapse under the weight of their own assumptions. He knew that confidence could be a weapon, but it could also be a blindness. And so he waited. He endured. He let his enemy stretch. There was no single moment when Germany began to lose. No dramatic turning point. Just a slow accumulation of small failures. A convoy sunk. A city not taken. A winter that lasted too long. An ally that did not fall. The war that was supposed to be over in months dragged into years. The soldiers who had marched into Poland singing songs about destiny found themselves freezing in Russian trenches, wondering why they were still there. And across the Channel, in London, an old man who drank too much and spoke too long kept standing, not because he was invincible, not because he had all the answers, but because he understood something his enemy did not. That history is not written by the loudest voice or the fastest sword. It is written by whoever is still standing when the noise finally stops. The intelligence reports continued to come in. Berlin was fracturing. The inner circle that had once laughed together now whispered in corners, plotting, blaming, scrambling for exits. The factories that had churned out tanks and planes were running out of steel, out of fuel, out of men to operate them. The occupied territories were rising, slow and bloody, draining resources and morale. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years was cannibalizing itself to survive another season. Churchill read these reports the same way he had read the mocking transcript 11 months earlier. Calmly. Quietly. Without triumph. He knew that wars did not end cleanly, that even in defeat, his enemy would inflict terrible suffering. That victory, when it finally came, would be soaked in grief and exhaustion, and the knowledge of how much had been lost. But he also knew that the man who had called him a fool had made a mistake. Not a tactical mistake, not a strategic mistake, a human mistake. He had believed his own mythology. He had mistaken momentum for inevitability. He had assumed that strength was the same as endurance, that conquest was the same as control, that loudness was the same as truth. And in that mistake, he had lost. Churchill never spoke publicly about the insult. He never referenced it in speeches or interviews. He never needed to. The response had not been written in words. It had been written in the continued existence of a nation that refused to disappear. In the slow, grinding reversal of a war that was supposed to be over before it began. In the quiet defiance of a people who chose to endure rather than surrender. Not because they were promised glory, but because they were told the truth and decided it was worth standing for. Years later, long after the bombs had stopped falling and the memorials had been built, someone asked Churchill how he had found the strength to lead Britain through its darkest hour. He did not talk about strategy or courage or destiny. He did not quote his own speeches or point to turning points on a map. He said that he had simply done what needed to be done. That when there is no choice but to stand, you stand. That when the alternative is to disappear, you remain visible. That when your enemy offers you humiliation or annihilation, you choose neither. You choose endurance. Because endurance, in the end, is not passive. It is not weakness. It is the slow, patient work of outlasting the storm, of remaining yourself when the world demands you become something else, of trusting that the loudest voice in the room is not always the one that will be remembered. The war would grind on for years. Millions more would die. Cities would burn. Borders would shift. Empires would crumble. Churchill himself would be voted out of office before the war even ended, cast aside by a public ready for peace and change, proving once again that history rewards endurance, not popularity. But on a quiet morning in late 1941, as snow began to fall over London and reports came in of German forces retreating from Moscow, a certain old man sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey in one hand and a half-smoked cigar in the other, and allowed himself the smallest of smiles, not because he had won, but because he was still there. And sometimes that is enough.